On a million. Gonna open on a bell.
I want you to look at those dates again.
You work on a trading desk, stop what you're doing for 1 second.
Wall Street veteran Bernie Madoff has been arrested and charged.
Because when I first saw them, I assumed there had to be an explanation, some sort of a miscommunication, that something was missing.
$50 billion is gone, vanished.
Bernie Madoff stole every dime we gave to him.
Wall Street fraud who masterminded the largest Ponzi scheme in history is going to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
And then I started digging, and what I found was worse than incompetence.
We lost everything.
Did people lose profits that they thought they made? Yes.
What I found was a system that was working exactly as designed, just not for you.
Now, Madoff's con extended far beyond the United States.
At least 8 firms lost at least $8.8 billion here in Geneva.
It looked like nothing from finance.
Basically a giant Ponzi scheme.
Ponzi scheme.
Ponzi scheme.
You don't get straight lines in finance. It took me 5 minutes to figure it out. This was explosive. This is going to rock the world. It needed to be stopped.
One guy led you to this pile of dung that is Bernie Madoff and stuck your nose in it, and you couldn't figure it out.
I want to pause and talk to you directly for a moment, okay? This documentary took 2 months to make, not because the Madoff story was hard to find, no, but because understanding what made this scheme possible, what we chose not to see, and what conditions are still intact takes time. It takes going through the testimony, patterns, architecture underneath the headlines, and that is the work I do, and I plan to keep on doing it. But the problem is, if you only hear from me when a new video drops, you are missing most of it. And that is why I write a Substack newsletter. It is where I share what I am finding out while the documentary is still being made. The pattern I noticed in the research that did not make the final cut. The question a viewer asked that made me rethink about something. And the next scheme I am studying before I even have a camera pointed at it. It also helps me build the body of work I want to be known for. Every essay, breakdown, or a way out, all in one place, accumulating over time. We can call it a library of pattern recognition you can return to whenever you need it. And here's what you get when you subscribe. Every week, I send out a piece of writing that does what this documentary does. It shows you the architecture underneath a financial scheme or a pattern worth knowing. And it gives you a way to think about it that actually helps. If this sounds useful to you, the link is in the description, or you can scan the QR code right there. Also, if you are not sure yet, that is totally fine. Keep watching. The rest of this documentary is going to show you exactly the kind of thinking you will find there. And for that reason, let's get back to our video.
I look forward to explaining to Congress today and the SEC's Inspector General tomorrow what I saw, when I saw it, and what my dealings with the SEC were that led me to this case being repeatedly ignored over an 8.5-year period between May 2000 and December 2008.
Here's what gets me. As far as I know, Harry Markopolos was not a conspiracy theorist. He was just a competing portfolio manager, someone who tried to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy for clients and couldn't make the math work. And so he did what any good detective does, follow the trail whenever it led, even if it was inconvenient. So he wrote it down and handed it over to the SEC and waited. And so I need you to ask yourself, what does it mean when the evidence arrives clearly labeled and nothing happens? What kind of system produces that outcome?
During the course of our investigation, we went to DTC and we got specific dates, for example, the date that Madoff testified before the SEC, and we compared the documents, the customer statements, with the documents from the DTC, and immediately we saw that there was there was no question that Madoff wasn't making anywhere near the volume that he said he was.
I kept coming back to this question. What would it have actually taken to stop him? And the more I looked, the more I realized that this was not about capability. The SEC had capable people, obviously, and this was not really about corruption in the Hollywood sense. It was about something quieter and more insiders than that. See, when your career advancement depends on not making enemies with powerful people, you develop a very sophisticated ability to not see what's right in front of you. And that's not a character flaw. That's just rational self-preservation, and that's what makes it so hard to fix. So let me ask you something directly. Think about your retirement account. your pension, your investment portfolio, whatever form it takes. How much of the confidence you have in those things is based on your own understanding of what's inside them, and how much of it is based on the assumptions that someone somewhere has checked. Because I spent months looking at how that checking actually works, and I think you deserve to know what I found. In 2016, the SEC examined more registered investment advisors than any of the previous 7 years. And you should note that this was a record-breaking year. The coverage ratio was 11%. That means in their best year, and by this I mean the year they were most resourced, most focused, and most productive, 89% of the people registered to manage your money were not examined, not even audited, checked, not even looked at. 89%, let that sink in. And that was a record year. In ordinary years, the picture is worse. According to findings presented to the SEC's own Investor Advisory Committee, citing the SEC's own internal study at the examination rate of 2010, the average registered investment advisor could expect to be examined less than once every 11 years. That is one examination per decade for the people managing your retirement. And that figure does not come from a critique of the system. It comes from a document the system produced about itself, presented back to the system as evidence that it was not working. So, which means the system documented its own failure, filed it away, and kept operating. Here's what I was not expecting to find. The examination gap was not created by Madoff's collapse. By the early 1990s, while his scheme was already running, the SEC's own internal record described the examination problem as having reached, and I'm quoting directly, crisis proportions. They said a small advisor might reasonably expect to set up shop and reach retirement without ever seeing an SEC inspector. Let me say that plainly. The system that failed to find Madoff was already in an acknowledged crisis for every single year his fraud was running. And this was not a surprise failure, it was a predicted one, written down in official documentation while the fraud was happening.
Look, I'm not proud that I did what I did. I spent a lot of hours trying to analyze why I did what I did. One of my problems was I always wanted to please everybody. When I started doing business, people showed a lot of faith in me. Now, I made them a lot of money, and everybody in the industry thought I was like this terrific success story, which I was.
After Madoff's collapse, the SEC commissioned a formal internal study. The findings triggered a public response from a sitting commissioner, Ellis Walter. Not a critique of the SEC, not a senator at a hearing, a commissioner inside the commission speaking on the record. She said, the SEC cannot fulfill its examination mandate with respect to investment advisors. And then she said something I've thought about ever since I read it. She said that even if the SEC had the resources to double its examination rate, even then it would still be insufficient. Double the checking, still not enough. That is a sitting regulator telling you in plain language, on public record, that the assumption your financial confidence rests on is not supported by the capacity of the system that is supposed to be doing the checking. This is not my conclusion, it's hers. And she said it twice, in 2011 and again in 2013, in case anyone missed the first time. Six years after Madoff's arrest, after the hearings, after the Inspector General reports, after the Commissioner's public admission, the SEC issued a press release. It announced a new initiative. The initiative was directed at investment advisors that had never been examined. Not examined rarely, and not examined infrequently. Never, not once, since registering with the SEC. By April of 2013, over 40% of all registered advisors had never been looked at, not once. The SEC called this category the never before examined. They gave it a name, they made it an official initiative, and they announced it as a priority in 2014. 6 years after the largest financial fraud in history collapsed because nobody checked. So here's what I found when I spent months looking at how the checking works. In the best year on record, 11% examined, 89% untouched. in ordinary years, once every 11 years on average. The examination gap in documented crises since the early 1990s while Madoff was running. A sitting commissioner on record, the SEC cannot fulfill its mandate, even doubled, still not enough. A formal initiative called Never Before Examined launched in 2014, 6 years after the collapse. And so I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because the question I asked at the beginning of this message, how much of the confidence is based on the assumption that someone, somewhere has checked, deserves an honest answer. And the honest answer, based on the record the system produced about itself, is that the checking is much thinner than most people assume. That is not my opinion. That's what they said about themselves. When I started looking at who actually invested with Madoff, I expected to find a story about ordinary people who got tricked. That would have been easier. What I actually found, and this took me a while to sit with, was a list of people who were, by any professional standard, more qualified than I am to spot a fraud. So I stopped asking how did they miss it and started asking a different question, which was what did they stand to lose by looking too closely? And that's where things got genuinely unsettling.
Look at the numbers. It's impossible that he's trading in the volume that he says he is. If you're getting good returns, people knew not to ask too many questions.
Here's something I don't think gets said enough about this.
The most genius version of this idea is Bernie Madoff, okay? Because Bernie Madoff, who had this effectively bogus investment fund, got billionaires coming to him saying, I really want to invest. Now, if you're a billionaire, there's one thing that drives you absolutely insane, which is someone saying no.
See, at some point in researching this film, I had to ask myself, honestly, whether I would have asked the right questions if I'd been in that room, if I'd been introduced to Madoff through someone I respected, if everyone I trusted had already invested, if saying no meant saying, I think you're wrong and I know better. And I'm not sure I would have. That discomfort is where this documentary lives, because the question changed from why didn't they see it to what does it take to see clearly when everything around you is built to make you not want to.
I gave them a roadmap and a flashlight to find the fraud, and they didn't go where I told them to go.
Bernie Madoff is pointing fingers. His target, banks and hedge funds that he says were, quote, complicit.
Fairfield Greenwich Group, the largest feeder fund to Bernard Madoff's Ponzi scheme with civil fraud.
The SEC, meantime, closing in on those who aided and abetted in that $65 billion Ponzi scheme.
Feeder funds were incentivized not to ask the question, to be willfully blind, if you will, and not get too intrusive into the Madoff scheme.
This is the part of the story I found hardest to tell. Not because it's complicated, it's actually very simple. It's hard because it asks something of the audience that most films don't ask. See, some of the people who are closest to this fraud almost certainly knew it didn't add up. Yet, they still made a choice. Not a dramatic one, obviously, but a quiet, financially rational, individual choice to not find out for sure.
Kumud Chairman Maurice Sonny Khan, Chief Operating Officer Marsha Khan, and Vice President Robert Jaffe were all named in the suit, and they're accused of funneling billions of dollars from investors into Madoff's pyramid scheme.
And I've been thinking about that choice for a long time, because I think most of us, if you're honest, have made versions of it. Not about fraud necessarily, but about something entirely different. A situation where not knowing served us better than knowing, where an arrangement worked and asking questions would have broken it. And that's not a confession of evil, I might say. That's just a description of how moral failure actually happens quietly, incrementally, and one small decision at a time.
Gold Dome, 5/8 bid open at the orders, 3,000 by 10,000. My offer, limit on the bid. We hit some sell stops before.
There's something about the timeline that I think most people miss. By the time Harry Markopolos filed his first report, some of Madoff's investors had already been in for over a decade. And I want you to think about what that means psychologically. A decade of statements, 10 years of telling your friends it was a good decision. A decade of that choice becoming part of your identity.
The whole concept of these new types of systems is to make it easier and more cost-effective for people to trade.
To question Madoff at that point was not just to question a former NASDAQ manager. It was to question yourself. Imagine this. 10 years of yourself. I think about that and understand it entirely. In a way I didn't understand at the start of making this film. How someone can know something is wrong and still not be able to act on it. And we are all in different ways in that traps.
Now to what turns out to be the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of Wall Street, fallout from allegations against Bernie Madoff and the realization that as much as $50 billion.
The FBI arrested him this morning after he told senior employees yesterday that his business was a giant Ponzi scheme.
Madoff Investment Securities has reminded us yet again of how badly reform is needed.
Hey, Mr. Madoff, what do you say?
After Madoff was arrested, the conversation turned immediately to regulations, more oversight, better enforcement, stronger penalties, and I understand that instinct 100%. It feels actionable. It feels like progress, but I want to push on it for a second, okay? Because I spent time looking at the regulatory changes that followed, and I found something very discouraging.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
In July 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act. It was the most significant piece of financial regulation since the 1930s, and it was supposed to be the answer. Section 914 of that act dealt specifically with investment advisor examinations, which was the exact failure that allowed Madoff to operate undetected for decades. See, Section 914 required the SEC to conduct a study on enhancing investment advisor examinations, not to fix the examination gap, just to study it.
Does your broker or financial analyst have your best interest in mind? That is the question. That is the subject near and dear to my heart. I think it's a much bigger...
The study was delivered in January 2011, and the SEC staff identified 3 potential solutions, which were user fees on registered advisors, a self-regulatory organization to conduct examinations, or authorizing FINRA to examine dual registrants. So, the most significant financial reform in 8 years responded to the most significant fraud in history by recommending that someone look into it. The SEC's own study recommended user fees, which was charging registered investment advisors an annual fee to fund the examinations that were supposed to be checking their work. In 2012, Congress introduced a bill to do exactly that. It was the Investment Advisor Examination Improvement Act. It didn't pass. In 2013, the same bill was introduced. It didn't pass again. So, the study said here is the problem, here is the fix. Congress introduced the fix twice, and twice the legislation that would have funded the examination of the people managing your retirement was cleared from the books at the end of the congressional session, as if it had never existed.
The Securities and Exchange Commission has penalized 8 employees for failing to spot Bernard Madoff's Ponzi scheme over 16 years. The agency said today the measures range from pay cuts to suspensions. No one was fired.
5 former employees of the infamous Ponzi scheme operator Bernie Madoff were convicted Monday on a wide range of charges stemming from what many consider the largest financial fraud in U.S. history. After a 5-month trial and 4 days of deliberation, a Manhattan federal court jury found 3 of Madoff's financial aides and 2 computer programmers guilty on dozens of counts, ranging from conspiracy to tax evasion. Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said Monday's convictions demonstrate that Madoff was not the sole operator in the fraud. Quote, the scheme these defendants helped perpetrate cost innumerable investors their life savings. Now it likely will cost the defendants their freedom. Bloomberg reports lawyers for the defendants unsuccessfully argued they were unwitting pawns in Madoff's fraudulent dealings, which cost investors an estimated $17 billion, plus $47 billion in fake profits. The trial was the first criminal prosecution of Madoff employees since the scheme collapsed in 2008 during the global financial meltdown.
In November 2011, the SEC announced the consequences for the employees whose failures contributed to the Madoff collapse. 8 people were disciplined, and nobody was fired. And this is not a small detail. The SEC's own head of human resources recommended that 1 employee be terminated. On top of that, an outside law firm hired to advise the SEC made the same recommendation. The then SEC chairman, Mary Shapiro, overruled both. Her stated reason was firing that employee would harm the agency's work. So think about what that really means. The person whose failure contributed to the largest financial fraud in history was considered too valuable to the institution to be held accountable by it. And the most severe punishment issued was a 30-day suspension and a reduction in pay. 10 other employees whose performance the Inspector General had called into question had already left the agencies. They weren't subject to any discipline at all. So the rules changed and the accountability did not. And then there's the revolving door. I mentioned earlier that Madoff was protected not through conspiracy, but through the social world that connected the regulator to the regulated. I looked at what happened to that social world after his arrest, and I found something very strange. Documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act show that from 2001 to 2010, spanning the final years of Madoff's fraud and the entire reform period that followed, 400 former SEC employees filed nearly 2,000 disclosures of intent to represent clients of business before the SEC. Between 2006 and 2010 alone, at least 219 former SEC officials left to advise firms on SEC matters. That's nearly 800 times. And the study that produced these figures described them as just the tip of the iceberg because disclosures are only required within 2 years of leaving the agency. One of those former officials, a branch chief in the SEC's Enforcement Division, resigned on a Tuesday. He joined Credit Suisse 6 days later, and this was happening during the hearings, during the Inspector General investigations, and during the reform debates. So the door that created the incentive not to find Madoff was still turning while the Congress debated on how to make sure it never happened again. So here's what I found when I looked at the regulatory changes that followed Madoff's collapse. The most significant financial reform in 80 years responded by requiring a study. The study recommended 3 fixes. Congress introduced one of them as a bill. Twice, it died both times. The employees whose failures the Inspector General documented in writing were disciplined with suspensions and pay cuts. The one firing that was recommended was overruled to protect the agency. And the revolving door between the SECs and the firm it regulates, the social architecture that made examining Madoff feel too expensive, kept turning through the entire reform period at a rate the investigators themselves called just the tip of the iceberg. So the rules changed here, but the incentive structures did not. And that is the honest answer to why your plan for protecting yourself cannot be the regulators will catch the next one. See, you can change the rules, but you cannot change the incentive structures that determine whether anyone enforces them. Also, the revolving door still turns around, and the career calculus for an SEC examiner has not fundamentally shifted. So if your plan for protecting yourself is that the regulators will catch the next one, I think you deserve to hear clearly that the evidence does not support that plan. I want to leave you with these 5 questions because Madoff's investors had access and didn't ask them. And I think part of the reason is that nobody ever put them directly in front of them and said that they matter. So I'm saying it now. Do you understand the mechanism, not the outcome, the mechanism by which your returns are generated? What would it cost you socially or psychologically to find out you are wrong about this investment? Have you avoided asking your advisor a hard question because you didn't want to seem unsophisticated? What identity do you have invested in this belief, and when did you last honestly challenge it? Are you in this because the evidence is strong or because the people around you are in it and asking questions feels like betrayal? If any of these questions made you uncomfortable, well, that's good because that discomfort is information and it shows you where the work actually is. And also, Madoff's investors were not failed by the absence of these questions. They were failed by the presence of a system that made asking these questions feel unnecessary, even disloyal. And that system is still operating. The only difference is that now you've seen it.
Basic concept of Wall Street, which sometimes the regulators lose sight of, as do the academics, is it's a for-profit enterprise.
I started making this film because I wanted to understand how someone like Madoff was possible in the first place.
I wake up every morning and my wife the things that matter I have, and he can't take them away.
And what I found by the end is that it was inevitable.
I want his family to feel the pain that they've inflicted on our family.
Mr. Madoff?
What he did to me, to my brother, and to my family is unforgivable. What he did to thousands of other people, destroyed their lives. I'll never understand it, and I'll never forgive him for it, and I'll never speak to him again.
Not because people are stupid or greedy, though sometimes they are, but because the conditions that sustained him are the conditions that we've built into how we organize money, trust, and status. And those conditions are intact. They did not go to prison with Madoff.
Have you talked to your dad?
I have no comment. I'm sorry, I can't help.
Confirming that 46-year-old Mark Madoff hanged himself at his home here at 158 Mercer Street using a dog leash.
I blame Bernie, and it's the worst thing that can happen.
The Madoff scandal took a tragic twist on Saturday when the oldest son of the disgraced, imprisoned financier was found hanging from a pipe in his fashionable New York City apartment, dead of an apparent suicide.
The next version of this is already running somewhere, and it may not be called a Ponzi scheme. It may be something entirely new or something entirely legal, and it will be sustained by the same psychology, the same institutional silence, and the same social cost of asking the wrong questions at the wrong time.
Andrew Madoff died of lymphoma at the age of 48, 6 years after father Bernie Madoff's infamous $65 billion Ponzi scheme collapsed.
The only thing that I know that actually protects you, the only thing that I found in doing all of this research is the willingness to look at yourself honestly, to ask hard questions even when they're expensive, to care more about what's true rather than what's comfortable. And most people won't, because the system is very good at making that feel unnecessary. And I hope this film makes it feel a little less unnecessary.